Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia 104. We're going to start on the bottom of 103b. Today's daf yomi is dedicated for Yeshua, for Am Yisrael, Shemer for the Chayalim, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim. So daf yomi tells us in the bottom of 103b, Hamakabel Sada Mechavero, somebody who gets a field from somebody else, either as a tenant or as a sharecropper. He based a shlachin, and this field is the field that's being irrigated, and there's a spring in the middle of the field, or Beitza Elon, or it's a field of trees, and there's trees in the field. Yavesh Hamayim v'niktzatza Elon, and then, as a consequence, the tree dries up, or the spring dries up, and the tree falls down. Since he didn't specify at the beginning when he rented it, I'm renting this field because it has this spring in it or this tree in it, and then the tree dried up, he can't deduct it from the rent. But in Amarlo Hakorwi Sada Beis Shlachan, but if he says, rent for me, I want to rent to me this specific field which has this spring in it, or Sada Beis Elon Zeh, or this field which has this tree in it, since he specified it, then if the spring dries up or the tree falls down, he can deduct it from the rent. The Gemara first asks the case, clarifies what's the field we're talking about, what's the spring we're referring to. What are we referring to? If we're saying that the Yavesh Nahara Rabba, that there was a great field, a great river that dried up, then why is he not allowed to lower the rent? Nemo Makas Medina. We're going to learn in a few days, God willing, about the fact that if there's a Makas Medina, if the whole country is affected by it, then the tenant can claim that he doesn't have to pay the full rent. So if that's the case, he shouldn't have to pay. So Amar Papa, the Yavish Nahar Zuta. So it was a small river that dried up. The Amar Way, we're on top of 104a, that the landlord could say to the tenant, listen, you still could have brought water, or you could have brought it in a pail. It would have been a little harder, but you could have done it. It says, Rav Papa, Hani Tarti Masnisa Kamaisa. So Rav Papa says, these Tarti Masnisa Kamaisa, Rav Papa says, these two first Mishnayos, Mishkachas Bein Mechakranusa, Bein Mekablanusa. He says, these two first Mishnayos in our chapter, they apply both to sharecroppers and to tenants, tenants who just pay like straight rent. From this point on, the Isa Bekablanusa, Isa Bechakranusa, the Isa Bechakranusa, Isa Bekablanusa. From this point on, the Mishnayos, generally speaking, Tosfos points out that it's not exactly the case, but from this point on, they apply to either one, either to the sharecropper type of fee or to the straight tenant type of fee. So now the Mishnah had said, if he says rent for me this field, this specific field, then we're going to say that if it dries up, he doesn't have to pay, he deducts it. Amai. So the Gemara asks the question, why? Why can't the owner say, Shema ba'alma amrilacha? Why can't the owner say, I just was referring to the name. I wasn't referring to a specific well within it. I was just calling it by the name of the field. Milo Tanya, didn't we learn in the Brayso, Omer Chavero, if somebody says to his friend, Beis Kor Afar, I'm going to sell you Beit Kor Afar, which could mean a field which has an amount of land that produces a core, or it could mean a field which is called Beit Kor Afar, Alpha Pisha Ein Boel Lesach, even though this field only has a lesach, which is half a core, higio, it's a valid sale. Shalom Macharo El Shma, because he said, I sold you a field that was basically called by that name. With the Miskri Beit Kor, as long as it's called by that. And so too, the same case with the karma, with the vineyard, and it has no grapevine to give, it's a valid sale. Shalom Macharo El Shma, he sold him a field that was called a grapevine. V'hu the Miskri karma, or Paradis and Imochacha, or selling you an orchard, Even though there's no pomegranates in it, he gives it to Valtel Shalomachro El Shma. Who the Mitzri party? So he just sold him a field that was called the Pardes, not an actually Pardes. So Alma Shma Ba'alma. He could say, I wasn't selling you a field with these dimensions. I was selling you something that was called by that name. Hachinami. Why can't he also say here? I was just selling you a field that was called the Beis Hashlachan, not that there was an actual spring in it. So Amar Shmuel. So the distinction that Shmuel brings is depends who's talking. If the landlord was the one proposing the sale, then we could say indeed he meant to say just a regular field called by that name. But if the Hadar Shma, you could just say I'm referring to the way it's called Amar. But if the tenant is the one who proposed it to the landlord, it's clear he wants that specific field. Ravina gives a different answer. Ravina says, no, in both cases, the landlord is speaking to the tenant. From the fact he says, this field, we're talking about a case where he's standing in the middle of the field. If that's the case, why does he specify the Beis Hashlachan? To come away, Beis Hashlachan, because he says, listen, a Beis Hashlachan, like we're standing in right now, basically he's saying like the way it is right now, that there's a spring in it, and so therefore it's clear that he intends to have that spring, and therefore he can deduct from it. Okay, so now up to the next mission. I'm a Kabal Sada Mechavero. So a guy enters into a relationship. I'm going to take your field and I'll use it like a sharecropper. I'll give you a half of what I produce. Then he decides not to work that year. Hovira, he leaves it empty. So Shamanoso Kamaruliolo Asos. We evaluate the field. How much crops would it typically produce? No single. And then the sharecropper has to pay it to the owner of the field because they had an agreement. He had to work the land. Shakach Koseva, because he would write. This is how they would write it in the document. Him over below Avid Hasham b'mitzvah. He say they would write in the document, if I leave it unworked and I don't work it, I'll have to pay by what the field would probably produce, what it's supposed to be producing. So Rabbi Meir. So since we said we're darshaning, we expound in that text the language that they wrote in the document, which is not necessarily the rabbi's language, but the language of the regular people. That's called the Lashon Hedyot. So therefore, Gemara is going to give 5 examples of how the rabbis of the Talmud derived laws from Lashon Hedyot, from just the regular language that people put in. So the Gemara says, Rameir himself would also expound these Mashonos of Hedyot, these expressions regular people would use. The Tanya Rameir Omer, he says, if I leave a fowl and I don't work it, I'll pay you by what it would produce. Number 2, Rabbi Yehuda also expounded Lashon Hedyot. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda says, Adam maybe carbon asher al ishto. So this refers to a case where a woman has to bring a korban. Let's say she was a yoledes, she gave birth, or mitzoras, or she was a leper, and then there's a sliding scale based upon her value. Man could have theoretically said, listen, he might have tried to say, listen, she has no money, so I can bring for her the poor woman's offering. So he's saying, no, he has to go by his wealth. So he has to bring the more expensive sacrifice. Also, the man is obligated to bring every carbon that she's obligated to bring. The man has to bring it. Tosfos says these are just the carbonos that are of an atonement, but they don't apply to voluntary offerings. Shekach Koseva, because this is what he writes to her when he gives her a ksuba. Achrayos to islach alai, the responsibilities that you have, they're upon me, min kadamas dena. Even going back prior to the marriage, I have to pay on your behalf. So it's his responsibility. The third approach, Hillel, the elder, would also expound just the regular way people talk, because we learn in the Brisa, Anshi Alexandra, Yimikachin, S. The people of Alexandria used to betroth their wives. Ubishas Knisas Chuppah, and heartbreaking when they entered the chuppah. So the people would come and they would grab them and they would kidnap the women. So from those unions, the rabbis wanted to declare the offspring to be mamzerim. So Amar and Hillel Azaken Hiviu Ksuva Simachem. Hillel the elder tried to save their children from being considered mamzerim. He says, "Bring me the ksuba of your mothers." Hiviu Ksuva Siman, and he brought the ksuva of their mothers. And he found out that they used to write into. When you come into the marriage, then you're going to be my wife. So therefore, lo asu b'nei mamzerim. So he said, actually, your children are not going to be mamzerim. That's what he derived as a result of this. Okay, so now we have to the next case, the fourth case, Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, who we said that many say was that Karcha is a reference to Rabbi Akiva because we know Rabbi Akiva was bald. So Rabbi Yeshua is the son of Rabbi Akiva. He also did it. The time Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha Omer, if somebody lends his friend money, William Shekenu Yoser Michovo. If you lend Reuben lend Shimon money, you shouldn't take a mashkon from Shimon that's more than the value of the loan. Shekach kosevo, because this is what he writes. Because this is what he writes. He writes as follows: Tashumta de islach alai kol kabel dichi. So he says, if you return to me, basically the halacha is that if you take a mashkon, let's say a utensil or a garment, the lender has to give it back to the borrower to use when he needs to use it, and if he needs to sleep at night or use his tool. So if he returns, this is how Rashi explains it, if he returns the collateral for a long period of time, we evaluate the mashkon and we evaluate how much it's worth, and we write this in the contract that this mashkon will be, I have a responsibility to pay what I owe you, and you can take from me the value of this mashkon. So if the mashkon is more than the debt, so he's going to collect improperly, because the actual contract was, you could take from me the value of this mashkon. So you give it back to him and say, if it goes that if I can't pay you back, then you could take from me this mashkon. So therefore, we have to make sure that the mashkon equals the loan. Time of the kasav hachi. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second. The whole reason is because you would write it like this, meaning to say, hi lo kasav hachi lo kanya. But if you wouldn't write this, he would be able to collect the whole mashkon. Is that really the case? V'amar Rabbi Yochanan mishkano ve'yishivu mashkon umeis shomto me'al gabe banav. So didn't Rabbi Yochanan say that if the lender took the mashkon from the borrower and then he returned it to him so that the borrower can use it, and the borrower dies, shomto, the lender could take it from the children of the borrower. And so this proves from here that even if he didn't write this contract, he's allowed to take it from the orphans. So what's the point of writing this out? Meaning to say, why does he have to write out a contract that if I don't pay you back, you could take it from this collateral, when we already know that he could take it, even he could take it from the borrowers. So what's the whole purpose? He could take it even from his children. So the Gemara says, "Ahani, it helps ksiva ani ksiva ligiron," that the shtar, the contract helps if the mashkon goes down in value because the borrower uses it. So therefore, he can take it from the other assets as long as it was written in the contract. A fifth approach to, we're on the top of 104b. A fifth example where there are Dorish Lashon Hedju comes from Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi says, Malkum Shenagu Asos Ksuva Malva. So a place where they had the practice to write Ksuva Milva, then Gova Milva. So a place where they had the practice where they would make the Ksuva into a loan, meaning to say, we'll see what Rashi says, that everything that's written, Shekoma Shekasa B'Shtar Ksuvasa, V'din Nidunya, Da'anal Aslemi Beina Shal Bala, that everything that you write in the Ksuva that she's taking with her from her father's home, Nifraes Mimenu Kishenis Armo Niskarsha, that could be collected from him when she becomes widowed or divorced. Kederach Shabachov Nifra Just like a creditor takes like everything that is collected from a loan document. So basically that they would evaluate the assets that the woman brings into her marriage from her father's home according to their actual truth. And so therefore, if the woman became widowed or divorced, then she would collect all of these assets according to what they're written in the contract, just like in the ksuba, just like the malva in general could collect from these assets. And the husband would also be able to collect from the father of the bride like a loan. So meaning to say that everything that's written in there you could collect. So the Gemara says, however, a place where the practice was lichbol go v'mekza, but there were a lot of places where they had the practice that they didn't just write the actual amount, but they doubled it as an honorific for the wife. They made it sound like she was bringing a lot more money than she was. So then he would only be able to collect half. Narbalai gabu tilta, and Narbalai they only collected a third. Maremer megabe nami shvacha. Maremer he would collect from the father of the girl. Even though he would collect the actual value, even though they had typically would inflate it. But didn't we say in the price that if they inflate it, we only collect half? So he says, "Lo kasha." The kanamine had the lo kanamine. It depends whether they did a formal kinyan, a formal acceptance of the transaction at the time of the ksuva. Ravina mishabech uksiv labarte. Ravina would inflate it when he wrote it for his own daughter. Amrle nickname mine demar. So they said, well, can we actually do a kinyan? Amrlahu, he said back to the son-in-law, he says, if you want me to inflate it, I'm not going to do a kinyan. And if I don't do a kinyan, then I'll inflate it. So Ahugara, there was a man, there was a man as he was dying, he said to the people around him, or his sons, he said, give to her 400 zuz for basically ubarte b'ksuvasa. Give my daughter 400 zuz for ksuva. But we don't know what that means because was he inflating it or not? So shalav ravacha b'rei d'Ravavi l'kamei d'Ravashi. When he says 400, does that mean he's giving her 400? So you write down in the ksuba 800. Or is he saying give her 400, but he really means only give her 200? Amar Ravashi Chazina. So Ravashi says, let's look. Amar Havula Arba Mea Zuze Inun Tamna Mea. So Ravashi says, let's see. Did he say Havu? If he said give it to her, well, that means Amar Havula. That means Arba Mea Zuzu Di Inun Tamna Mea. That means if he says give it to her, it means give her 400, which means to write down 800. But if he said Yamar Ksuvula, but if he says write it for her, that means it's Arba Me'azuzu the Inun Masan. That means write for her 400, but only give her 200. Alternatively, Amar Vashi Chazina, and we look, Yamar Ksuvasa Arba Me'azuzu, or alternatively, we say that if he said for her Ksuva 400 zuz, that's the Inun Tamni Mea. That means write 800. But if he says Biksuvasa, inner Ksuva, that means Arba Me'azuzu, that means 400 zuz the inum masa, but it means really only give her 200 because he says right in the ksuva 400. Veloi, but that we don't actually learn like that. Lo shna damar liksuvasa, lo shna amar biksuvasa, armei zuzah the inum masa, and ada amar havelastama. In the end, we say it doesn't matter if he writes liksuva or biksuva. It means write in 400, but give her 200, unless he actually said to her, give her 400. Oh, Gavra the Kabbalah Ramachavre. There was a man going back to the case of where the sharecropper decides not to work the land. There was a person who got some land from his friend, Amar, as a sharecropper. Amar imovirna la yavino alpha zuz. He said, listen, if I don't work the land, I'll give you 1,000 zuz. Now what he did was ovir tilta. He let a third of the land not work. He left a third of the land empty. So Amar Nardai, Dino diavilatlas me'ot tlasin. Tilsa, so he has to give him 1/3 of 1,000. He left it on work. He left it fallow. Rav Amar Asmalta. Rav says the whole statement is an Asmalta. It's an exaggerated statement. And he didn't really take seriously. Asmalta Lokanya, it's not binding because it's an Asmalta. Well, Rav, according to Rav, says the whole thing is an Asmalta. Why is it different from what our Mishnah says? If I leave the land fallow, then I have to pay according to what it would produce. So Gemara says, Hasam will kugazim. Yeah, because there he wasn't speaking in exaggerated words. Hakim in the Kamar Milsi Serasa, since he said extra words here, Guzman ba'amahu the kugazim. So he's actually speaking in exaggerated terms, so we don't take it literally. Who gathered the kabel aro shum shemei? So a guy received land to grow, to be a sharecropper, to grow sesame. But instead, sesame is very expensive. It produces a high yield, but it ruins the land. So it weakens the land. So zarachita. So instead, he planted wheat. And the wheat had a tremendous growth. It produced as much money as sesame would. So Savarav Kahana Meimar, Menakile Kachashadar. So Rav Kahana thought to say, okay, the sharecropper can deduct from the owner of the land the amount that typically it would have weakened. So the sharecropper should get more money. So Amr Rav Ashi, Rav Kahana, Amri Inshi, so Rav Ashi said back to Rav Kahana, no. People will say, people say, let the land weaken, but not the man weaken. Meaning, people say under those circumstances, you still have to pay the full value. Who Gavra, there was another man, the Kabul Aro Shumshe Zara. There was a man who received some land for sesames and Zara Chiti, and he planted instead the wheat. Abda Chiti Tfeim and Shumshmi. And in fact, in the end, the wheat made even more money than the sesame. So Savra Avino Amemar Yav Shivcha the Beni. Ravina thought to say that the sharecropper, since he planted the wheat instead of the sesame, should get all the profits that the wheat produced. Meaning to say, the difference, if he was expecting to have to give him $100,000, if they were expecting the net to be, the yield to be $100, in this case it's 120, the difference between 100 and 120 should all go to the sharecropper. But Rav Hachami Difti responded to him and said, Atu, who is Bechara? You think that the sharecropper is the only one who improved the land? The land had nothing to do with it also? So both of them were involved in the improvement. So both the sharecropper and the landowner, so they split that too. So now we're going back a little bit to what we had in Ezo Neshach with interest cases. And we talked there about a relationship called an Iska relationship where a person provides merchandise in order to be sold, and he wants to be basically as a loan, but it's also viewed as a loan and as a deposit in order to mitigate the loss, but also to allow the person who's the money in the arrangement to make some profit without charging interest. So the people in their Adai said, "Hi Iska, when you do this type of arrangement, let's say you give them $100 worth of wheat, we're going to say Palga Milva Palga Pikadon. We're going to say that the $50 worth of wheat is going to be viewed as a loan, which the borrower has to pay back regardless. And the other half of the wheat, we're going to view it as a deposit, meaning to say that they're going to share in the expenses, to share in the possible loss, but sure also in the gain, and they have a relationship. The rabbis did something that would be good for both the borrower and the lender. Meaning to say that that it's good for the borrower that it's viewed that we're going to say that it's going to be good for both the borrower and the lender, because if it would be entirely viewed as a loan, and then the person who got the property would be responsible for all the loss. Even though he wants to sell it, he'd be responsible for all the loss. So therefore, nobody would be willing to take upon themselves this risk of selling this wheat. But if you viewed the whole thing as a deposit, then the entire loss would be on the owner of the wheat. And so nobody would want to give it to anybody else to sell. So Hasha Damrina Palga Malva. So now that we said half of it belongs to the lender, Ibayla Mishta Beis Shechra. So you say now that we said half is a loan, so the merchant who's getting it, basically the managing partner, well, maybe he could just turn into go take the money and drink beer with it. Would you say Shapir Dami? Would you say that, well, since it's half a loan, maybe you can just go drink beer with it? Rav says, no. Iska, that's why we called it a business, or an Iska, the Amarle, because the lender could say, he put restrictions on the loan. I gave you the money to do business, not to go drink beer. Amar Avidi Bar Abin V'Meis. So now that we said it's a loan, so Now let's say the managing partner dies, and now the money is transferred to his children. Now, do we generally say when it's a movable property that was given as a loan that from orphans, there's no lien on the movables? So would we say in this case, would we say that the money has become like a movable vis-a-vis his heirs, and so therefore he's not going to be able to collect with a lien? So the Gemara says no. Rava Amar Lahachi Karue Iska. Now that's why it's called a Iska. The mace. That's literally why we classify it as an Iska, to say that you can't collect it from the heirs. So Amar Rava Chada Iska Utrei Shtare Pseida de Malva. So Rava said if you would say that one part would belong to the managing partner and two parts would belong, meaning to say of the profits, of the half that is going to go to the, well, first of all, we'll stop the recording here because this is already the next stop, but we can go on.